Ephesians 5-8:14. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness. Rather expose them. For it is shameful even to maintain what such people do secretly. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible. For everything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it says, "Sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Thank you.
That was awesome. Thank you for reading. We're going to be a little interactive today. I mean, we can still have a chance to talk afterwards, but there'll be some times in which I'm just going to be asking questions and asking for ideas and input as well, because we are a community and we create better together than we do individually. Let's get started. Her violin playing was like fingernails on a chalkboard. He's as blind as a bat. Looking for my contact lens is like searching for a needle in the haystack. Joe ran like a gazelle in today's race. In everyday conversation, we often speak of one thing to tell us something about something else. It's referred to as an analogy. Dictionary is moderately helpful when it says an analogy is a comparison of two otherwise unlike things based on a resemblance in a particular aspect. When we talked about Joe running like a gazelle, can you suggest some things about a gazelle that makes this analogy work? Anyone? Fast. Anything else? Graceful, yes. Anything else? So an analogy is a type of figurative language that helps us make a point that is difficult to comprehend or one that is emotional and more than it's factual. It's figurative rather than linear because gazelles run on four legs and go about 80 miles an hour and Joe didn't, right? But we kind of inherently know that we've got an analogy that we're talking about something as an example, not necessarily as the literal truth. Analogies let you feel something that simple facts don't. Fiction writers often use them to tell you something about a character's personality. Bob was the black sheep of the family, right? I mean, that says so much, but it's just a couple of words. He could have written, well, Bob had been in trouble on and off for many, many years, and he could have gone on, but he says it all in a sentence in a way that tells us something else. They are common in our faith teachings, old and current. Last week we talked about living water. We talk about the bread of life all the time. The parables are chock full of them, right? You know, the mustard seed, the one about the seeds, some of them fall on fertile ground and some of them fall in the weeds. The lost sheep. And even here, we use an analogy to describe our community. The table is long and the table is wide. We don't actually have a long or wide table, right? But it says something about us and it feels right. Not because it's literally true, because it says something about us being welcoming. These worked especially well in biblical times. They work because God designed and created us, and he designed and created what is around us, what we call nature. Christ tells a story using natural things from everyday life. That story leads to a learning about God and about faith. Christ wants us to know more than just facts. He wants to change our heart with these stories. Let's look at the parable of the lost sheep as an example. What is the learning behind the parable of the lost sheep? How did Christ want this story to change our hearts? Can anybody tell me in a sentence or two? Yes, no matter how far you wander. Yep. And what about the last sheep? That it was, that God would. Yeah. So Christ could have just stood up and said that, right? But he didn't. Instead, he tells us a story about sheep. And this one in particular had a lot of traction because remember, in those days, sheep were pretty important. Some of them were shepherds. I know we've got a couple of shepherds among us, but that's a little rare these days, right? For others, maybe mutton was, the meat that they would get every once in a while, but there wasn't a lot of meat, right? And in their small communities, I'm sure everybody knew when somebody had lost a sheep. And everybody knew that that family was really hurting because of the loss of that sheep. That was a significant resource for that family and maybe even for the whole community. Telling this story gave an emotional punch to the learning that doesn't come through just speaking it. And like those fiction writers who like to use analogies to describe a character, it speaks more strongly to the character of God. So let's use this thinking and look at today's reading from Ephesians. And a piece of background information may be useful. The letters to Ephesians were written to an established community of Christian believers. The purpose was much more around formation of a community of committed believers than it was around conversion of individual non-believers. So just keep that in the back of your head. We're going to turn it on first. There. So there you go. So this is the reading we just heard wonderfully read. Thank you. In the example of the lost sheep, it was good for us to think about what life was like in biblical times. And in this case, it may also be useful for us to think about what life was like, not with respect to sheep, but with respect to light. So can you think about some differences between what life is like now with the light that we have and what it would have been like in biblical times? Anybody? There's probably less light, right? What does that mean to their life? How would they feel about that? Is it safer? I hear no's mostly. Yep. So the sun would have been their primary light most of the time. I don't know the history that well, but I can't imagine that a lot of them had candles or a lot of them had lamps. Yeah. But a couple of them did. It was probably pretty precious. And as of now, we just turn on a switch and never think about it, right? We may be unhappy when the bill comes, but we just turn on the switch and don't think about it. How about in terms of safety? Safety, livestock, right? They probably had to worry about their livestock at night, right? And since we know how important livestock must have been to them, it was a huge portion of their net worth, if I can use that, kind of silly to apply to a shepherd, but and even they would be at danger. I'm sure there were animals that could create some problems. So let's look at this couple of particular things here. Get this right? So I want to focus on, for once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. That's how it starts. And then towards the end it says, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for everything that becomes visible is light. These lines can be a bit perplexing. We're used to hearing about being in the light, but not being the light. I think the analogy in this particular phrasing is related to the simple concept of reflectivity. So if I grabbed one of Sarah's flashlights, if this room was dark, imagine the room's completely dark, and I took a flashlight and I pointed it at the wall, the light would spray out throughout the whole room. It wouldn't be as bright as it would be in the flashlight, but it reflects back. And I think it's that idea of reflection, which must have been known to everybody at that time. The wall has effectively become a light source. So it has light shown on it, and it is showing light. It is sending out light as well. The NIV for this passage actually says that last line is, and everything that is illuminated becomes a light. So we have this kind of odd aspect of this analogy. We're used to talking about being in the light of God's love, and we're used to talking about we want to be a light. But the one in the middle is we want to be light. And I don't know about anybody else, but that struck me as kind of interesting. So when we say, for once you were darkness and now in the Lord you are light, any thoughts about what it means for us to be light? What does light do? Who has some examples of what light does? Could be an encouragement, yep.
Makes things grow.
What's that?
Makes things grow.
It makes things grow and productive. Bear fruit, maybe? Yep. It goes everywhere. Yeah, it goes everywhere. Yes. So did you ever notice that the further away you get from light, the less power it has? Does that suggest anything? Exactly. Yeah. So doesn't that give us a hint that we need to stay close to God and maybe stay close to our community? Because isn't that kind of what our job is together? To provide light for each other. Maybe one needs it one day and the other one, and the next day that one is giving light. That's our job as a community. Let's look at another portion of the reading. So in the middle it says, take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, rather expose them. So when I saw this at first, I thought of the kind of the Old Testament meaning of expose, right? Which means that you go tell everybody about it. Look what he's doing, There are lots of Christians who feel a duty to expose everybody else's sins. And I'm not just talking about the Westboro Baptist Church nuts. I think there's lots of faith communities where it's often used as a justification for what is really just gossip. But I don't think that's what meant here. In the context of the rest of this passage, I think it means something different, maybe something even a little bit more difficult. Sticking with the analogy, when light is present, it exposes darkness, and we are the light. I see this as encouragement for us to stay present in the world, even the darkest parts. Not to participate, but to be present. And it's kind of a challenge. It says, I don't want to make fun of monks who climbed into a cave and spent the rest of their life praying. I'm sure that has some value, but this passage really calls us to do something different, I think. It calls us to be present where there is darkness and be a light. To be a light where there's nothing but light doesn't really do much. It doesn't advance God's kingdom at all. We actually have to interact with the darkness a little bit. We don't want to be part of it, and we don't want to participate in that darkness, but we also can't just hide ourselves. Now let's look at another portion of the reading. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Interesting that we have so many children today and we're talking about how do we walk as children of light. I don't know about you. I find that to be one of the most beautiful phrases that we've heard in a while. Let's unpack it a bit. So what does the word walk bring to mind in this passage? Does it trigger anything emotionally or otherwise? A journey? Yep. Active. That's what I thought as well. Active, moving, not just standing around. What else? Yes. 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 Again, emphasizing that importance of community. Is it a rushed and hurried thing? It just said race, and it says walk. Suggests to me, gentle, full of grace, more thoughtful, steady. Yep. Calm, not rushed or hurried. And then the whole thing about children, I think, is really neat. the passage tells us that light is our parent. And I think that's kind of amazing. What are some aspects of having light as a parent that might be valuable to think about? Who do children imitate? Their parents, right? And so we're being told that we are children of light, and so we want to imitate it, right? What's the real job of a child? What's the most important thing a child can do? Grow? Play is a good one, yes. But grow and mature, right? And so our job as children, our job is to grow and mature in our light. I think the other thing about parent is that not only do we imitate, but we are somewhat dependent, right? Children are dependent on their parents, right? And aren't we dependent on the light? And back to Debbie's point, we probably don't want to wander away from it too much, right? This is something that we are very much dependent on. We look to it as a source of nourishment and growth. So there's one other thing here I think that we've kind of touched on a couple of times, but I want to highlight. These words were written not to individuals or an individual, but to a community of believers. And a couple of times we've seen things which hinted that the community was very important. Can you think of some community aspects that are worth looking at with respect to light? We kind of talked about the need for us to be each other's lights at time. If our job is to grow and mature, and if we need to be in the light of our community and be in the darkness, in which of those do you think most of our growing and maturing would occur? In the community. So we're here. The purpose here isn't just to stay here, because we want to be walking, we want to be active. But we're here because this is where we get nurtured. And this is where we go from a really, maybe an infant, right? To follow the analogy, we go from an infant and hopefully maybe as a teen, and we go more and more out into the world, out into the darkness, and to be a light. So that should be happening. That should be what happens in our community, right? What behaviors would you expect to be present in a community if we are going to be light? Care. Love and care for each other, definitely. And really kind of love and care anybody, right? The interesting thing about the darkness analogy is that Christ is speaking to those who are in the light, but those who were in the light were at some point or another in the dark, right? We were all in darkness. I had my decades, okay? And, we're not that different than the people that we talk about who are in the darkness. Another reason why we shouldn't stand back and say, oh, look at what they're doing, right? We don't have the right to do that because they're not that different than we are. But other attributes or other behaviors. We talked about grace, right? I mean, isn't that something that's kind of implied in all of this? And of course, we always talk about the light exposing the truth. It's up there, right? Where the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And so if we be light, shouldn't we be living in truth? Anything else? Mm-hmm. Supporting each other by, and it's accountability. You want the accountability that's asked for, not the accountability that's dumped on you. But yeah, I mean, that's and kind of when we become members, you kind of say, well, I agree to be held accountable. I agree, I'm open for you to talk to me about something that you don't agree with or something like that. And I mean, it's kind of a different agreement. I mean, in this world, we don't do that very often. We've got a pretty rare arrangement here where we say, okay, I'm willing to listen to you if you think I'm wrong. And that's what I think being a member of a community. Any others? Yeah. 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 Yeah, the word shame in here actually kind of worried me a little bit because I I think that maybe it meant something in those days that it doesn't mean now, but right now it does. I don't think of a healthy environment as an environment that is driven by shame. I think it's driven by something more mutual than shame. Mutual means that you know you think I didn't do something right, and I kind of think you're right, and that's kind of how we mutually grow in sharing. But yes, other things, anything else? So I would argue that even though the word doesn't come up at all in this passage, that if you want to be joy, sorry, I blew it. If you want to be light, you're going to have joy, right? Anybody argue with that? If you're going to be light, you're probably going to have hope. If you're going to be light, you're probably in it and pretty serious about it, not just dabbling. Okay, just to go over a couple of things that we talked about. When we're reading the Bible, it's helpful to think about the biblical time context to understand some of the analogies that are used. The Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, everything. I mean, we don't want to even get into Revelations, right? The analogies in there just make my head spin. But, with all of those, I think it's valuable for us to just spend a minute to think about what was life like back then. And, what was it? How did that make these words grab people a little bit more maybe than it grabs us? We should look to articulate some of the characteristics of God that the analogies refer to. So, when we're looking at these parables and stuff, we kind of get a feeling from them about what God is, but it's probably also good for us, at least internally, to articulate it and to say, well, that's something about God that I hadn't thought of before. And then this whole thing about when we are in God's light, we are God's light, and we are a source of God's light. I mean, I feel like part Buddhist or something. That's a pretty convoluted kind of a thick space to be in, but I also think it's pretty beautiful. I think historically I always connect the end to, right, the being in the light and being a source of light, but this passage introduces that concept of being the light, and I think that's the most extraordinary thing about it. And then I think we could spend months talking about what it means to walk as children of the light. And finally, I'd encourage you to think about the community aspects of this. We talked about a lot of them, but we should be certain that behaviors among us reflect the fact, no pun, that demonstrate the fact that we are trying to be light, not just trying to be lit or be the source of light.